Hi, this is Luke Robbins. This is assignment 7. I'm going to get started here and try and make this quick because my free recording software does have a limit, and also for your sake, try not to make this too long. So the first one that I'm going to kind of demo here is looking at color light. So we've got our models here, and you can kind of see as it moves around, the light affects our different faces here. And so in this guy, just color light, we see setting send world and material in the render stage, setting spotlight parameters, setting light parameters, and then rendering, setting up these two when we create the object, and then the ability to change the world and color as we saw kind of in the example code. And then over here we've got our graphics object, our models loading individually, our shader loaded, and then kind of combined in the graphics object there. The second one I've got over here is just texture in our graphic object. We've got our shader texture, our pointer to a texture, which when we create our graphics object gets set to what's passed in. So this one gets a shader, a texture, and a model. And we see in dxapp.cpp that the texture was loaded separately. And actually, during runtime, if I want to change the texture that I have for the model in this object, then I can do so with on mouse down. I can modify that. So here we create the model, create the texture, and then can pass it to the object, and then modify that later by set texture if we need to. Number 3, we've got combining some of those elements. So in our HLSL file, we've got color times the texture value there, and up here you'll see wherever it is our constant buffer here, constant buffer for that information. And so now we've got our textured box going in and out of a spotlight that's acting on it there, so you can see both of those effects. And that's, again, kind of that combination. I've got the texture, got the shader, and over here, kind of similar, setting the directional light and the point light. The timer is so that I can show you that movement. And as we go in here, we both send world and material, which is going to be this half of it, and then setting spotlight, and also setting texture, resource, and sampler, which is what we've got in our shader. And so once we've got those, moving on to the mesh versions of these. And so for this one, this is just going to be the color version. So it's going to be color light. We create our graphics object, set each of the colors. We have our model, same as before, and also in terms of light, we've got and there, so you can see that gleam and acting differently on the different faces. In terms of eye position, if you go through my code, you'll see I handle this in a couple different ways, just to show you, because I wasn't really sure. In the original one, we've got, and by original I mean example code, we've got this guy, the shader sets it to context, and in one of my other classes I have a graphics object method that just does the exact same thing, but just to take away something from the shader to try and contain as much as possible in there. As we discuss this, I'm sure can just sort of do that last kind of cleanup on draw scene, but it's about there. So for the texture version of this graphics object, what I did was I created an array of textures right here, yep, right there. Our texture shader had this, which each of those positions fills up with a texture that we've created here, and then pass those to the graphics object. So what we've got is this guy. So it's already passed to him, so this is kind of redundant, but I was just sort of playing around with this. But later on, and further on in the program, what you can do is you can then reset the texture there. And so you can access each of one of those individual ones, and they can be, other textures that you load up here in your main app. And, like set color, we've got a set texture, which can either overwrite all of them or a specific mesh number. And in the render stage, we go through each of them, set texture resource and sampler with the proper texture element, and then render. And so finally, we've got putting it all together, the light, the texture, and the mesh. Yeah. And so here we just do the same thing as I was talking about, setting each individual texture. And you can see the light, especially on the bottom part, as it moves in and out of the focus of that spotlight. And so we're setting world material and this each time. And same thing. And then in the shader, we've got things for color and texture. I want to make sure I get this in on time here. So just to discuss the further work, talking about rendering with potentially different shaders per mesh. So to allow different shaders per model, sort of as is, what we do is, we create our shaders in DXApp, and then what we do is we create our graphics object with a specific shader. And so we could start out with just one, or we could do something similar as we do with textures. Is what we could do is kind of create maybe an array, or it could be done as a list. As my SE456 lessons come back to me of shaders, and depending on what we want to do, we can set the shader that we have, active to context. So it could be like, set, shaders at position 3 to context, and then render. And in our rendering state, we could act differently based on which one we have going. So setting, calling a method to set a shader to context could also do other functions in order to indicate to the rendering stage what it should do. So in our case, we do a lot of things with, we've got light, we've got texture. If we just want to do one of those, we don't necessarily have to use everything that we've got contained in here. So even though we've got a lot of information pertaining to light, if we want to do one that doesn't necessarily involve light, this stage will set world, it will set world instead of sending world and material. Or if we don't want to use texture, we will just send color, using the shader that we have active. And then doing that, we kind of have all these options that can be sort of dynamically called with maybe just an argument or two in the main application. Graphics object, dot or arrow, render with argument of render by color or something like that, or graphics object dash set color context graphics object 1.render. And so that's kind of what I was envisioning, is kind of packaging all of this together and having a couple other means of kind of indicating what we do here. And that way the user is kind of separated from that logic, and all they have to do is flip a switch, and back here we can do what we need to set up the proper stage here. And so that could be done either maybe with a conditional, or having specific, or with an argument, as I just said, or even having specific render functions, which I don't like as much as I think about it. But you could have, render as color, render as texture, and things like that. I think that's about it.